Chinese Communist Party, which, of course, Trump and Republicans have fiercely criticized. Or with that, patriotism and propaganda, they've been a key part of education and other aspects of life since the CCP came into power in 1949. But then a very key thing is that back in 1994, the country explicitly adopted the language of patriotic education, them unveiling new guidelines in an effort to reassert control over the country in the wake of the Tiananmen Square massacre. But then also, just in the past decade, we've again seen a resurgence of this idea. With us seeing in 2016, for example, the government issuing a directive calling for patriotic education to permeate each stage and aspect of schooling, with this being not only through textbooks, assessments, and museum visits, but also through the internet, which there, of course, is highly controlled, but still a very important source of information for many young Chinese people. And with that, the directive specifically demanded that university and college students be, quote, clearly taught about the dangers of negativity, about the history of the party, nation, revolution, and reform, and opening up, as well as vilifying heroic figures. And then, in 2019, China stepped it up again, coming out with a sweeping new update to the guidelines. With this notably happening at the same time as a new wave of mass protests sprung up in Hong Kong against mainland interference. And what we've seen is that in the past few years, as China has worked to solidify its grip on the territory, education has been a huge focus. Right? I mean, they just came out in 2024 with a new patriotic education law aimed at, quote, enhancing national unity, with a new curriculum being implemented in Hong Kong, including lessons on Xi Jinping thought, or the personal philosophy of the Chinese president, which was actually enshrined into the country's constitution in 2018. But also with this, what's very notable is it's far from just China where we've seen similar developments over just the past few years. Right? In Turkey, for example, a 2016 coup attempt led to an authoritarian crackdown in which thousands of teachers, academics, university administrators, and education officials were removed from their jobs. With that also being part of a wider purge, the scale of which has been described as nearly unprecedented, with it also reportedly involving the firing of thousands of police officers, the detention of thousands of soldiers, and the shuttering of more than 100 media outlets. And not much later, you had President Erdogan announcing his plan to raise a pious generation by expanding religious education in public schools. In fact, even straight up replacing secular public schools with religious ones. And notably, he tried to justify the measures by claiming discrimination against Muslims. And with that, later saying, our aim is to raise young people equipped with national values. And this, while in fact his policies pushing religion and traditional or family values, they've actually reportedly led to increased discrimination against religious minorities and the LGBTQ community. And this also, as there's some stuff in common there with what's been going on in Hungary, where you've had Prime Minister Viktor Orban also embarking on a campaign of so-called patriotic education, revising school curriculums to restore national self-esteem and celebrate the country's Christian identity, and later banning LGBT content in schools and on kids' TV. Of course, that was just one small part of a wider culture war largely being fought by attacking civil society, including, and perhaps especially, focusing on education. Right back in 2018, for example, forcing out Central European University, which was once considered one of the country's leading institutions of higher learning. Though this also, as it was hated by some for the fact that it was founded by the conservative boogeyman, George Soros, with the mission of promoting democracy and human rights after the fall of the Soviet Union. Within all of that, bringing us to Brazil, where Bolsonaro, the guy who's been described as the Brazilian Trump, he actually came to power campaigning in part against alleged Marxist indoctrination in the classroom. And with that, he then attempted to implement an overhaul of the education system in that fashion, announcing plans to revise textbooks to remove references to feminism and homosexuality. With that, I'll say, Bolsonaro isn't president anymore. He lost an election without conceding defeat and then sowed distrust in the country's electoral system as part of an alleged coup attempt, and he has since been barred from holding public office in Brazil until 2030. Meanwhile, if we look to India, though, you have Prime Minister Modi still hanging on to power, with experts notably saying there that he has increasingly embraced the ideology of Hindu nationalism, and with that, also going back to 2016, you had high-ranking officials pushing to make the country's education system more patriotic, with them calling for a greater emphasis on national heroes and the teaching of history, and even suggesting making mandatory the singing of the national anthem by school children. And what we've actually seen is what's been described as a crackdown on dissent at universities and on college campuses, as well as the rollout of new textbooks casting Modi's policies in a positive light. In 2023, for example, students in thousands of classrooms received new textbooks removing Muslim history and Hindu extremism, with them, for example, removing references to the links between Hindu extremism and the assassination of Gandhi, the secular foundation of post-colonial India, and riots in 2002 in which hundreds of Muslims were killed. And this as they slashed or straight up removed chapters about a time when much of India was ruled by a Muslim empire. Which then, speaking of empire, that brings us to Vladimir Putin and his efforts to return Russia to its glory days. Ever since coming to power in Russia in the early 2000s, Putin has insisted that students learn patriotic values in schools. But again, over the past few years, this effort has just ramped up big time. A recent study, for example, suggests that educational reforms picked up speed following the annexation of Crimea in 2014, with the Russian government that year, for example, approving a new set of history textbooks praising Putin's achievements. With then, in 2020, Putin putting forward legislation adding patriotism and war history to the country's existing law regarding school curriculum, with his amendments specifically seeking to add, quote, a sense of patriotism and citizenship, respect for the memory of the defenders of the fatherland and the achievements of the fatherland's heroes. And then, of course, since 2022, he has only placed greater emphasis on education in an effort to drum up support for the invasion of Ukraine, revising school textbooks and introducing teaching guides that help teachers deliver so-called patriotic lessons, as well as launching a new nationwide children's and youth movement dubbed the New Pioneers. With all that, you have researchers unsurprisingly saying the increased emphasis on patriotism, it has coincided with a decline in freedom of speech in the classroom. With, for example, us seeing surveys suggesting there are fewer opportunities for students to critically discuss what they've been taught in history classes. And also, the teachers, they're more likely to be fired for publicly expressing political views. And ultimately, of course, this is by design, right? The studies show that education, it serves as something like a long-term insurance policy for autocracies. But if you teach young citizens to be loyal to the authorities, this helps promote long-term social and political stability, with, for example, the Washington Post explaining, autocrats realize that schools help create generations who share their ruling values and principles and are loyal to the regime. And looking at these other countries, where they were, how they've become more authoritarian over the past few years, you see the parallels. Right? The very notion of patriotic education, the justifications given for it, mass firings and purges, the role religion can play, the way the LGBTQ community has been victimized, it all rings a bell. Right? There's nothing wrong with being proud of your country or loving where you live. But it's also important to know, as we look at the US, the call for patriotic education, it is part of a bigger overhaul of the Department of Education. In fact, we've talked about it over the past few weeks and months. You have the Trump administration recently signing an order to virtually abolish the department. And despite the fact that he lacks the constitutional authority to do so, he's moving forward. Where dozens of staff have been put on leave, and DOJ has been directed to review education spending and already announced millions in cuts. And then beyond all that, Trump has signed orders that could reportedly drain millions from universities, with many worrying that this threat will be weaponized to bring universities in line. And this also as he signs an order entitled Seeking to Expand Access to Private School Vouchers. With this then seeing critics like the president of the American Federation of Teachers arguing, this order hijacks federal money used to level the playing field for poor and disadvantaged kids and hands it directly to unaccountable private operators. With notably private school students in the US going to religiously affiliated institutions and just about half going to Catholic or conservative Christian ones. Which is why you had the executive order Most of All being celebrated by a movement that has already helped funnel billions in taxpayer dollars to religious schools. Right, in this, playing out, as you also had Trump signing an executive order not aimed specifically at education, but aimed at eradicating what he called anti-Christian bias in the US. With that, announcing that Attorney General Pam Bondi would be heading up a task force to investigate the targeting of Christians. And with all this, right, all of this is not to say that the situation in the United States is currently remotely on par with places like China or Russia, where the country's leaders are single-handedly dictating what students see in their textbooks. There are a lot of reasons that it's very hard to imagine things getting that bad, at least everywhere in the United States, right? The president doesn't have the power to set curriculum. Additionally, Congress ostensibly has the power of the purse, though schools are largely funded at the state and local level anyways. Plus, even when states and localities have tried, surveys of teachers show that most don't change their classroom materials or methods in response to conservative laws. But it would also be a massive mistake to think that there's nothing happening, or that there's not a lot of room in the middle from where we are in total control. And as you have places like the New York Times explaining, public school educators are often fearful of running into trouble with higher level authorities. And it's possible and even likely that Trump's executive orders will lead to some measure of self-censorship. Plus, while federal funding to public schools is limited, most of what does exist, it helps prop up high poverty and rural schools in areas with weaker tax bases. Right, so they're the ones most likely to be affected. And similarly, the Education Department provides discretionary grants aimed at helping low-income students and minority groups, as well as students with disabilities. But many of those programs, they're currently under review by the agency to determine whether they defy any of Trump's executive orders. And then also, in what's been described as an extraordinary step, the department announced that the Office of Civil Rights had dismissed pending complaints that people had filed to the office over efforts to ban books about race and gender, with the office announcing that it had ended what it called the Biden book ban hoax, with it basically referring to previous guidance saying that book bans might create a hostile school environment or infringe on civil rights. And of course, all of this at the federal level, while at the local level, some states and school boards have really taken a heavy hand in trying to dictate what can or must be taught. But with all that said, I got to pass the question off to you, right? Whoever you are, I want to know your opinions and reactions to this, but also, especially if you're involved in teaching or education in any way at any level, I'd love to know your thoughts. And then we'll get to more news in just a moment. But first, coffee is a part of most of our mornings, right? But regular creamers and sugars, they're just empty calories that lead to crashes. So if you're looking for the ultimate productivity hack, today's sponsor for wellness, it has you covered with the Good Stuff Focus. Trust me, it is good. No pun intended. One scoop into your coffee, and it's like my brain just got a software update. A subtle mocha flavor that doesn't overcomplicate things, simple, yet it's just right. To me, it's not that sugar alertness. I'd call it a cleaner, more calming sense of focus that keeps you sharp with no crash vibe. But it's packed with ingredients that actually work, like theobromine to boost focus and mood, L-theanine for sustained energy without the jitters, collagen for that skin and joint glow up, C8 MCT oil for that lasting energy, and even Himalayan pink salt to keep the coffee's vibe in check. And the good stuff's made in GMP certified facilities backed by actual research. So whether you're grinding at work, crushing a workout, or just trying to survive the day, this is your moment. And seriously, with over 10,000 5-star reviews, you got people obsessing. And once you try it, I think you'll see why. And ultimately, save 25% with your subscription by clicking the link in the description or scan the QR code and use code Philip DeFranco for free shipping.